Okay, good morning. My name's Andy Sharp. I'm at Nikkei. I'm your moderator today. Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last month prompted China's People's Liberation Army to conduct days of large-scale military drills encircling Taiwan, creating an effective blockade. But these tensions across the Taiwan Strait are reverberating across the world and pose many questions. Would the United States intervene should China attack Taiwan? Would Japan get involved? How will China react if President Tsai's ruling DPP retains the presidency in 2024? Lots of questions. And here to talk about these issues is Amanda Hsiao, a senior analyst for China at the International Crisis Group, a Brussels-based think tank. From her posting in Taiwan, she assesses the dynamics and risks of escalation in the Taiwan Strait. And this week, she's in Tokyo to exchange views with Japanese experts and officials about the future of what The Economist once called the most dangerous place in the world. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Amanda. She'll speak for around 20 minutes, and then we'll open the floor and to online viewers for questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Andy, and to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan for inviting me today to speak on this very important issue to the region. The current situation in the Taiwan Strait is in a state of flux in which the three key actors, the US, China, and Taiwan, are engaged in an escalatory bargaining process over what the status quo should be in the Taiwan Strait. This bargaining process has been and will continue to be characterized by dynamism, uncertainty, and risks. And until and if the three parties arrive at a new understanding or a new equilibrium about the status quo that is acceptable to all three. So to be clear, the three parties have never fully agreed on what is the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, but there's been enough ambiguity around it that created enough space for all three parties to be able to say that my preferred interpretation of the status quo continues to exist. So what is the status quo? So for decades, Beijing and Washington have relied on overlapping, though not completely convergent, understandings of Taiwan's status. Beijing's position is that there is only one China, of which Taiwan is a part. Its objective is unification with Taiwan, an outcome that it sees as crucial to its national rejuvenation and the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. And it holds out the possibility of using force. Washington's position is defined by the One China policy, in which the US recognizes the PRC's view of, recognizes the PRC as the sole legitimate government of China, and acknowledges Beijing's view that Taiwan is a part of China. It doesn't recognize this view, however. And so it adheres to the position that Taiwan's status remains unresolved and must be settled peacefully and not unilaterally. So Washington maintains unofficial relations with Taipei, governed by the terms of the Taiwan Relations Act, which states that US policy, of course, includes providing Taiwan with defensive arms. So these positions have really allowed the US and China to arrive at a set of understandings under which they normalized relations in 1979, and it has managed tensions since. But these understandings and arrangements have begun to unravel. The status quo has never been static. All three parties have been pushing and pulling, since the establishment of the status quo. But shifts in the status quo now are seen as more threatening and more significant by each side because of the intensification of US-China competition, one that is increasingly ideological, made all the more so because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And very quickly, in terms of the status quo between China and Taiwan, the status quo under the previous Taiwanese administration under Ma Ying-jeou was marked by the 1992 consensus, a loose understanding in which both sides agreed that there was only one China in the world, but operated under, again, ambiguous and different understandings of what exactly that meant. This understanding, too, so the cross-strait understanding, has also fallen apart because of a growing disparity between the political systems of China and Taiwan. So how has the status quo changed recently? What are the key shifts? So on the Chinese side, for Washington and Taipei, there are three key shifts that are particularly concerning. First, under Xi Jinping, the goal of unification is now explicitly tied to China's national rejuvenation, meaning that Beijing is publicly attaching greater strategic importance to Taiwan and linking it to China's rise to major power status. And implied there is an implicit timeline because national rejuvenation is supposed to occur by 2049. So there we have an implied timeline that unification would have to occur by 2049. Second, Chinese military capabilities have advanced so much that the use of force to compel unification with Taiwan, while not yet viable, is becoming more viable. The PLA has rapidly modernized, resulting in a shift in the US-China military balance of power that is increasingly in China's advantage. And third, Chinese intentions just generally appear to have become more aggressive. So for one, China's actions abroad have been more assertive and ambitious, suggesting aggressive intent could accompany Beijing's military buildup. We've seen this in the South China Sea and along the border with India. Domestically, and particularly Chinese actions in Hong Kong, indicate that the Chinese leadership is more willing to use repressive means to exert political and social control over its population. So in the context of Taiwan, we've seen that Beijing has engaged in a campaign to diplomatically isolate Taipei. Since 2016, Beijing has successfully peeled away 8 countries that had previously recognized Taiwan. It's begun to block Taiwan's participation in international forums, even though the participation status was unofficial or in observer capacities. It no longer accepts that there are multiple interpretations to the 1992 consensus, and military coercion has increased. So we've seen sort of near daily intrusions of Taiwan's air defense identification zone. So all of this combined means that Washington has begun to see the odds of a potential military invasion of Taiwan by China as becoming too high, and is seized within a sense of urgency to take actions to deter such a scenario. For Washington, again, the expectation has always been that Taiwan's status should be resolved through non-unilateral peaceful means. Of course, there are shifts on Washington's and Taipei's side as well. So on the US side, what we've seen is the US view of its relationship with China has changed in fundamental ways. The view that engagement and the deepening of economic ties with China could lead to political reform within China and can curb Chinese assertiveness is no longer in vogue. The mainstream view now is that Washington is in a strategic competition with Beijing, one that will require more friction. So China has become the pacing challenge, and a Taiwan contingency has become the pacing scenario for the Pentagon in its upgrading of its defense capabilities. Second, the US is also attaching greater strategic importance to Taiwan and is using language and taking actions that elevate Taiwan's political status. Now, it's important to emphasize that Washington sees itself as catching up to events, so to the shifts that have occurred under Xi Jinping. So Washington now calls Taiwan a key US partner in the Indo-Pacific, and it is placing much greater emphasis on its commitments to Taiwan. In a December 2021 testimony, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs Eli Ratner said that Taiwan's security is important to the US because of its location in a critical node within the first island chain, and that defense of this is critical to the defense of vital US interests in the Indo-Pacific. This rhetoric implies that Washington, at least for now, would prefer for Taiwan to remain de facto autonomous from China. Washington has internationalized the Taiwan issue as well in various ways. Bilateral cooperation has deepened, and there is a greater sense of urgency around bolstering Taiwan's defense. So far, the Biden administration has approved 5 tranches of arms sales to Taiwan. So from Beijing's perspective, Washington is cynically using the Taiwan issue as a pressure point in the larger competition. And all of these actions from Beijing's perspective represents a hollowing out of the commitments that the US had made to China on Taiwan. And it believes that its actions strengthen Taiwan's claim to de facto independence, and it is concerned that Washington's preferred end goal is actually a one Taiwan, one China situation in which Taiwan's separation from China is the de facto and status quo in perpetuity. And then finally, on Taiwan's side, the shifts that we've seen include growing Taiwanese resistance to deepening cross-strait relations, particularly among the youth. So in 2014, we saw a student protest movement emerge in response to the passing of a trade agreement between China and Taiwan. There are changing attitudes among the youth about identity. So in July 2022, a survey showed that only 2.4% polled identified as only Chinese, while 62.7% identified as only Taiwanese. So there is a sense that the one country, two systems solution that China is offering to Taiwan has become increasingly irrelevant, particularly after the Taiwanese population saw what occurred in Hong Kong. And so the Tsai administration, what we've seen from Taiwan is a firmer assertion of sovereignty. The position that they are taking is that we are de facto already a sovereign state, so we do not need to declare ourselves formally independent, and that China and Taiwan are not mutually subordinate to each other. And under the Tsai administration, she has not accepted the 1992 consensus. And so what all of this means is that what China has been offering and continues to offer, this political arrangement, a one country, two systems arrangement, which would leave Taiwan likely with little to no political autonomy, and what Taiwanese prefer, which is the continuation of their democratic system, is increasingly hard to reconcile. So these shifts in attitudes, in approach, in how the three parties are talking about their interests, they are interactive, particularly between the US and China. Each side believes that it must take actions to signal its resolve and its commitment to its respective position in response to shows of resolve by the other side. So Pelosi's visit to Taiwan is a great illustration of this interactive and escalatory dynamic. When Pelosi first announced her intention to visit in Taiwan, Beijing, which was earlier in 2022, Beijing was already sending very clear signals that it saw such a visit as provocative, and they were extremely public about this in an attempt to deter this visit. However, by the time it happened in late June, the publicity around a potential visit because of a leak to the media made it politically impossible for Washington and Taipei to publicly reject Pelosi's visit. Beijing made public promises of retaliation for the visit, and given its timing of the visit in relation to the 20th Party Congress, Beijing had to follow through with some show of force that both escalated above the existing baseline of activity, but also would not result in a direct confrontation with the US. So we saw what China did. They followed through with unprecedented military exercises surrounding Taiwan, a variety of bans on imports and exports, cyber attacks, et cetera. The political objective of China's response to Pelosi's visit was to deter the continued upgrading of the US-Taiwan relationship by increasing the sense of risk and the costs of continuing down that road. But given attitudes in Taipei and in Washington right now, the inclination will be to push forward rather than to hold back in the face of coercion by Beijing. And if tit-for-tat actions are public, Taipei and Washington will both feel compelled to show public resolve in response. So for instance, we see that there are calls in the US for Washington to militarily push back against China's military activities at the median line in the Taiwan Strait. We saw last week that Taiwan shot down a civilian drone, a Chinese civilian drone, after China leaked a video of the Taiwanese military throwing rocks at Chinese drones, which effectively created a lot of pressure on the Tsai administration to show their resolve publicly. So Taipei and Washington's show of resolve will beget additional responses from Beijing and so forth. So what are the implications of all of this, escalatory bargaining process? In the short term, there will be a prolonged period, a period of heightened tensions marked by an increase in military activities and posturing in and around Taiwan, particularly by the PLA, but also shows of resolve by the Taiwanese and American military. This means that the risk of an unintended collision has grown, including in the Taiwan Strait, where military activities around the median line has increased. And remember that right now, a couple months ago or a month ago, the Pentagon has reported that there has been an increase in unsafe and unprofessional encounters between the US and China more generally. So far, the military interactions we've seen at the median line, they've been characterized by a fair degree of control and restraint. It's clear that the Biden administration is aware of the risks. Beijing also does not want a war to break out directly with Washington, but human error can always occur. And a significant incident, one that could escalate into a crisis, would result in a massive disruption to global supply chains. According to Bloomberg, about half or almost half of the world's global container fleet passed through the strait this year. Besides a hardening of attitudes in all three capitals, China's response to Pelosi's visit creates a period of opportunity for those in Taipei and Washington to deepen their unofficial engagement, particularly in terms of military cooperation. And of course, these actions will then feed into Beijing's anxieties around changes to the status quo. We've seen that Taiwan announced an increase to its defense budget recently, and the US just approved a $1.1 billion USD worth of arms, including the sale of anti-ship missiles and air-to-air missiles, which is a significant increase from previous sales under the Biden administration. On China, in the short term, any shifts to its Taiwan policy will likely only emerge after the 20th Party Congress, which is next month, after Xi Jinping has secured his third term and consolidated power. We may see a more proactive policy on Taiwan emerge. So the fundamentals of China's policy on Taiwan will stay the same. It'll include a preference for peaceful reunification while reserving the use of force. It'll be based on the one China principle and one country, two systems. On the economic side, China may roll out additional preferential policies for Taiwanese investors and businessmen on the mainland. On the military side, China may take more steps to assert its sovereign rights across the Taiwan Strait. For instance, by dispatching law enforcement vessels on the Taiwan side of the median line when given a significant enough event between the US and Taiwan to respond to. In the short term, a full Chinese military invasion is unlikely. Beijing is not militarily ready to execute an amphibious invasion, and its rhetoric, both outwards and inwards, does not indicate that it seeks to launch an invasion anytime soon. Let me just spend a couple of minutes on what should be done. So there is a bit of optimism around the fact that all three actors share the same goal in the short term, which is preventing a war on Taiwan. So to that end, the Chinese, American, and Taiwanese militaries should exercise the utmost restraint in their military operations in the Taiwan Strait and around Taiwan. Washington and Beijing should utilize existing crisis communications channels and mechanisms, and regional governments should encourage Beijing particularly to use them. Official communication channels for crisis management should be established between Beijing and Taipei, and all three sides should try to avoid overtly public shows of resolve, which ultimately reduce the political maneuvering space for decision makers on both sides, pushing them to respond publicly in an escalatory fashion. In the medium term, a significant decrease in tensions would result from an improvement in US-China bilateral relations, but that is incredibly hard to see taking place anytime soon. So given this, and given the fact that the three parties' preferred end state for Taiwan look increasingly irreconcilable, the best interim solution is to create, one, the conditions for Beijing to kick the can down the road, and two, make the prospect of unification by force too risky for the Chinese leadership. In order to make a military move on Taiwan too costly for Beijing, Taiwan, the US, and its partners and allies, including Japan, should make clear the military and economic costs that they would impose on China in such an event. This includes strengthening Taiwan's ability to defend itself. And as for creating the conditions for Beijing to kick the can down the road, this is harder because Xi Jinping has created an implicit deadline for unification of 2049. Between now and then, however, it does remain useful for Washington to continue to diplomatically reassure Beijing that the US continues to uphold its one China policy, that it continues to operate under the commitments that it made to China under the three communiques. And of course, it would require that Taiwan does not declare formal independence, which is unlikely in the short term. Just one last point on implications for Japan. So as the Japanese government has said itself, the links between Japan's security and stability in the Taiwan Strait are evident. First, because of Japan's geographic proximity, with Yonaguni Island just 110 kilometers away from Taiwan, it is increasingly difficult to see how a Taiwan military contingency would not affect, at a minimum, the waters and airspace around Japanese territory. The map that was issued by the Chinese of the 6 exercise areas, Yonaguni sat between 2 of them. Second, a scenario in which China fires on US bases in Japan during a military contingency would represent a direct armed attack on Japan. So the possibility that Japan and Japanese territory might be involved in a Taiwan contingency suggests, one, it is also in Tokyo's interest to deter this scenario. Therefore, Tokyo should also consider the balance of military deterrence and diplomatic reassurance that it should pursue. This will include continuing to signal in its official statements the linkages that Tokyo sees between its own security and stability in the Taiwan Strait and its growing concerns. But beyond signaling, Tokyo should also begin to prepare for such a contingency. This would include upgrading Japan's defense capabilities and engaging in more concrete contingency planning on its own and with the US. These preparations themselves would, of course, also serve as a deterrent to China. And so let me just conclude. I'm happy to say a bit more about some of the conversations that we've had, but so the key actors in the Taiwan Strait are engaged in an escalatory bargaining process over the status quo. That process is unlikely to conclude anytime soon, so we are in a period of increased risk of miscalculation that could have wider regional ramifications. The actors can take steps to mitigate those risks, including telling their militaries to act with restraint, to keep lines of communications open, to refrain from overtly public shows of resolve, and for the US and its allies and partners to pursue a policy of military deterrence and diplomatic reassurance. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. Okay, we'll move to Q&A now. We're taking questions from the room, and I also have some questions online, which I will ask as well. So when you come up, please state your name and affiliation, and the floor is yours. Martin.
Martin Kölling, Handelsblatt from Germany. I will first ask only one question and maybe later a few other questions. Since we are in Japan, of course, we are all interested what you learned in Japan about the the possible stance of the Japanese government.
Okay. Am I taking them as a group, or you're just taking them as they come?
Just take the one at a time. It's probably easier.
Okay. So I've been here with a couple of colleagues, including Laurel back there, for a week, taking meetings with a number of experts and officials. I think what struck me is to learn the sort of level of importance and priority that's of a Taiwan Strait contingency, the fact that it has come up in every conversation. It appears very much to be the focus of discussions here. I think that the government's intentions will be made clear by the end of the year with the new national security strategy that will emerge and the defense guidelines. So there's 3 documents that will be a much clearer indicator of exactly the intentions of Tokyo. Some of the challenges that we have heard, according to conversations here, and the ones that Tokyo will have to work through include ensuring the safety of its citizens in both Taiwan and China in a military invasion scenario. It will have to reduce its defense vulnerabilities in the event that it is pulled into a conflict alongside the US with China. And so a lot of that, what we've heard in conversations, are one, to increase the survivability of Japanese military assets in the event of a military attack by China, but also to increase potentially their retaliatory abilities against China. Tokyo apparently will have to think through the legal authorizations that would be required for Japan to respond, and the bureaucratic process that this would require, and take into consideration how much time that process would require when in the middle of a crisis. And finally, there will be necessarily some thinking through of how Japan and the US will respond to the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands in the midst of a contingency, and to anticipate the ways in which Chinese movements on Taiwan could also involve moves on those disputed islands. So there's, to sort of sum up, I think it's clear that the issue of planning for a Taiwan contingency, discussions around increasing the budget and increasing Japan's defense capabilities are apparently top priority, but at the same time, it does appear that there are a number of challenges that the expert community will have to work through as well to be better prepared.
Okay, thank you. I'll take a question online and then I'll come to you. Okay, so this is a question from Patrick Welter from the German newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. He asks, he talks about the so-called silicon shield idea, meaning that the Taiwan's semiconductor industry concentration helps to keep it safe. What is your view on this argument?
So this is definitely an argument that the Taiwanese themselves will emphasize. And I think we've seen that there are significant concerns about the supply chains in the midst of a military invasion. I think that to some degree, the potential cutting off of chips from Taiwan to China does serve as a deterrent, but it needs to be understood as one element to deterring China. I don't think the prospect of the end of imports from Taiwan alone is sufficient to deter China. Let me go a little bit more in depth as to why. The decision to move militarily on Taiwan is fundamentally a political one. So, if there is an event that, for instance, the event that I think would definitely trigger an invasion would be if Taiwan declared formal independence. Now, if Taiwan did that, then Beijing would have to move on Taiwan. So regardless of any sort of economic costs or military costs and political risks, that is a sort of event that would prompt a move on Taiwan. So fundamentally, it's a political decision. If tomorrow the PLA developed all the capabilities that it needed to successfully conduct forceful unification, it wouldn't necessarily take that option. It's not entirely dependent on its military capabilities. Again, it's fundamentally a political decision. So going back to chips, certainly the Chinese are, to a degree, as the rest of the world is, dependent on Taiwanese chips. We've seen efforts in China to develop its own chip-making capabilities. They still lag behind. Of course, it's debatable whether China would need the most advanced chips to keep its economy floating, right? So it's not that they absolutely need the most advanced technologies from Taiwan necessarily to survive. So it does, I think, serve as a form of deterrence, but only one piece.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
So Richard Solomon from Beacon Reports. What's your opinion about Japan deploying long-range, non-nuclear missiles to up the ante should China, or to prevent China from possibly attacking Taiwan, and as part of the improved self-defense policy that you started to talk about?
Right. Thank you. So I think, so clearly there are ongoing discussions here in Tokyo about developing standoff missile capabilities. I think that given what we know about the PLA's capabilities, not only is it important for Tokyo to develop those capabilities, but also to ensure that those missile systems can survive and are resilient following the initial stages of a potential military attack from China. So much of the discussion beyond the development of those capabilities amongst Washington experts and seemingly Japanese experts, but also Taiwanese defense experts, is focused on how do we ensure that these systems survive following the first minutes of an invasion. And so that means that beyond missile capabilities, the development of mobile systems, strategies to sort of create decoys and to be able to move these systems around after the initial barrage. So I think yes. So to your question, I think I think it is becoming an important piece of not just Japan's, but the U.S.'s and Taiwan's deterrent strategy. But even beyond that, there's many more considerations about how to ensure they survive beyond the initial minutes of an attack.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we've got another one online here. This is from our club president, that's Peter Elstrom from Bloomberg. He has two questions. The first question is, do you think Pelosi's visit was a net positive or a net negative for Taiwan? And the second question is, should China launch a quick takeover of Taiwan, what happens next? How will the world respond? Will it play out like China's takeover of Hong Kong with essentially no material reaction? Or would the US, Japan, and other allies have the means to do anything after such an attack?
Let me take the second question first. I think given the level of, given the rhetoric we've heard from Tokyo, from Washington, given the amount of international attention focused on Taiwan right now, given all of these moves to upgrade defense capabilities, I think there will certainly be a strong response from the US and perhaps the Japanese to a Chinese move on Taiwan. We've heard President Biden himself he himself has expressed what could be understood as his personal feelings about whether the US would militarily intervene. And one could assume that if given his statements, that he personally would be inclined to militarily intervene in the situation where China moves on Taiwan. That's not speaking for the rest of the bureaucracy. That's simply pointing to what Biden has said himself in off-the-cuff statements. So certainly there would be, I think, if I had to guess, if an attack were to happen tomorrow, there would be some degree of US military intervention. That doesn't necessarily mean that the US would have boots on the ground in Taiwan. It could simply mean that they move their assets to beyond the first island chain and they operate from out there and from US bases in Japan. So certainly, I think given what's happened in Ukraine, I think we can also assume that there will be attempts to impose economic costs on China in the event of an invasion. So we can expect that there will be sanctions, financial sanctions that are similar to those that have been imposed on Russia, and there would very likely be trade embargoes as well to try to squeeze China economically in such a situation. Whether Pelosi's visit was a net benefit or net cost to Taiwan, I tend to think that the risks there have exceeded the benefits, largely because it was a very symbolic visit by the speaker that produced relatively little concrete benefits to Taiwan. The benefits that it produced, there's some value, of course. I don't want to say that there was no value to Taiwan. The value there is that the visit has contributed to the feeling that it's quite normal for parliamentarians and for lawmakers to visit Taiwan, and that it shouldn't be seen as some sort of taboo decision or action by any countries. So in that sense, given Taiwan's political status, given that the very few countries in the world that recognize Taiwan, this is of some political value, sure, to Taipei. But if we're talking from the perspective of deterrence and bolstering Taiwan's defense or diversifying Taiwan's economic relations, has that visit produced any of those concrete agreements? Not in the interim. It has certainly contributed to greater political attention in Washington on how important those issues are. But so far, we haven't seen anything particularly concrete emerge just because of the visit. Many of those moves, the arms sales, the bilateral discussions about Taiwan-US economic relations would have proceeded without Pelosi's visit. So on the whole, my perspective is that the risks exceed the benefits. And what we've seen too, of course, is that China has used the opportunity, has used the pretext of Pelosi's visit to expand its military presence in the Taiwan Strait and around Taiwan. So it's allowed China to push its forces closer to Taiwan, which of course creates added pressures for the Taiwanese military, and as I said before, raises the potential for a miscalculation, a military miscalculation. So on the whole, I tend to lean that way, but again, that might not be the Taiwanese government's perspective.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I have a quick, not a quick question, just a normal question. Sorry. So recently, the Taiwanese government announced an increase in defense spending of around 15% for the 2023 budget. But there's a lot of calls for reforms of Taiwan's military. Yeah. So could you give us your assessment of Taiwan's current defense capabilities? And could you give an idea of what kind of reforms might be necessary to improve its defense?
Sure. So there's been a lot of debate about the sort of optimal defense strategy that Taiwan should pursue. There's the debate basically concerns the fact that Taiwan faces different kinds of threats from China, and the fact that Taiwan will have a limited defense budget. This is the dilemma that Taiwanese decision makers face. So what are those threats? How are they different? So there's two types of threats that Taiwan faces from China. One is the sort of day-to-day gray zone pressures, gray zone coercion that they face in their air defense identification zone, so PLA aircraft coming in daily. Now, following Pelosi, we've seen that Chinese military vessels and aircraft are also crossing the median line in the Taiwan Strait, and they're maintaining that presence. So in order to push back or to respond to that, Taiwan needs some level of conventional capabilities, which means fighter jets. It means large surface platforms and vessels. But that's not the only threat that Taiwan faces, of course. Taiwan also faces the looming threat of a full amphibious invasion by China. And that military contingency requires a different set of capabilities, what's called asymmetric capabilities. And Taiwan had been going down this road to develop their asymmetric capabilities, which would mean that they would have mobile, dispersed, small military systems that could survive the initial attack of China, a barrage of missiles, essentially. So they would be able to survive the initial onslaught, and following that, the focus would be on denying Chinese success of an amphibious invasion rather than defeating China. So the objective there would be to deny Chinese success. So the short of it is, there is an ongoing debate in Taiwan. It's not settled yet. Washington prefers Taiwan to pursue an asymmetric strategy. They have been more forceful about what they prefer following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There clearly needs to be more discussions between the Taiwanese and the Americans as to the ideal balance between conventional and asymmetric capabilities. An increase in budget is not really valuable if there's no alignment on what that budget would pay for, right? And increasingly, there might be divisions between Washington and Taipei as to what the optimal strategy is, especially in the wake of Pelosi's visit, because we've seen an uptick in Chinese gray zone activities. Okay? So we've heard in the media that Taiwanese officials are more concerned about those activities now, which then continues to fuel the debate about what is that balance we need to strike between conventional and asymmetric. On the personnel front, there is also an issue. So since Taiwan has moved to an all-volunteer force, I think it's hard to comment on the quality of those forces. I have myself not, spoken to personnel directly, but the number of personnel is, of course, dwarfed by the number of personnel that China has, but also the reserve system. So, on top of active duty military, Taiwan has reserves as well. Taiwanese reserves only undergo 4 months of training, which is fairly little. There has been discussion of extending that training period to 1 year, but that has not, the discussions have not turned into concrete policy changes just yet. Some of that appears to have to do with some domestic political resistance. On the surface, people are, in favor of course, upgrading Taiwan's defense capabilities. But then when it comes down to, asking individuals to sacrifice their time to be part of trainings that are seen rather dismissively by Taiwanese society, to be frank, is another thing. So asking for those personal sacrifices, I think, is a whole nother thing. So.
Thank you. Any more questions from the floor? Martin again.
Martin Körling, Handelsblatt again. You mentioned you called upon the players basically to restrain their impetus for symbolic gestures. How optimistic are you that they will be able to restrain their reflexes? Especially in one area is the legal risk that the United States Congress might act for some domestic political issues, and basically set up some Taiwan acts that are basically forcing China to respond. And in China, I wonder how high is basically the support of a military action among the public. I read some reports that especially in the middle class, there's quite high support actually for a military response. So this is, of course, also something that maybe the Chinese government, the Chinese leadership has to take into consideration. So how positive are you that they will be able to restrain themselves?
Yeah, thank you. That's it's a challenge. So as you have suggested, there is a Taiwan Policy Act of 2022 that will undergo markup at some point in the United States Congress. There are elements of that, of the draft text that would be seen as extremely provocative to Beijing if it were passed in its current form. However, it's still early days, and our understanding is that there is a fair amount of opposition to the text in its current form, and that there will likely be amendments to the text. The Biden administration has also made efforts to share some of their concerns around some of the substance of that text. So, to answer your larger question, so there are certainly efforts by Washington on this particular piece of legislation. Whether the Biden administration can control Congress, well, clearly from the Pelosi visit, we've seen that as soon as, I think the key there is to remember that because the visit was made public, because discussion of the visit was made so public, that made it politically impossible, I think, for the administration to publicly say that the visit shouldn't go forward. So there was a chance or opportunity in this whole event to have postponed the visit, but it was a leak to the media that I think made it impossible. So to say that it wasn't inevitable that she visited during the time that she did. There are domestic pressures both in Taiwan and in China as well, as you allude to. So for Taiwan, I don't know the poll that you're referring to, but based on my conversations in China, a polling, oh, I see, Chinese nationalists, okay. So what's interesting about that is you might have seen that there was a fair amount of domestic criticism in China for the way that Beijing chose to respond to Pelosi's visit. Part of that is because some very loud nationalist figures, I'm referring here specifically to Hu Xijing, the former editor of the Global Times, was very loudly proclaiming that the PLA should shoot down Pelosi's plane or prevent the plane from landing. And this excited a lot of Chinese nationalists. And so when this did not happen, a lot of them were disappointed and made it publicly known. The way that China has responded to it is indicative. What they essentially did was they trotted out a bunch of military experts to explain just how unprecedented their military exercises were. So they emphasized that it went far and beyond what China's response to the third Taiwan Strait crisis was. Those exercise areas overlapped with Taiwan's territorial sea. We fired missiles over Taiwan. We were able to force the U.S. to retreat to beyond the first island chain. So there was this playing up in domestic propaganda of just how firm and decisive China's response was. And that was very much aimed at, as they would put it, guiding public opinion around this event. I think that Beijing was very aware of some of the discontent that was expressed, and I think for the most part, they are able to manage voice the sort of chatter of discontent from their nationalists. What's also interesting is, it's not just military experts. They've had some very senior ranking officials come out as well, and PLA media with commentary come out essentially explaining to the Chinese public that now is not the right time for a full military invasion of Taiwan. It's essentially saying, listen, we are in full control of the situation. We remain confident in our ability to unify with Taiwan, but a military invasion requires a lot of planning, and the timing is crucial. And so this is the sort of domestic rhetoric that's coming from Beijing. I think it's largely been effective, but it's also telling of their intentions, at least in the short term.
I'm T.W. Kong, a professional associate member of this club. Two brief questions, if I may. On Chip 4, the Taiwanese have been fairly, I believe, accommodating to the U.S. side. Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturers such as TSMC and UMC. These manufacturers have operations in China, PRC. If the conclusion really becomes very, very final, what is the Chinese government likely to do with TSMC's and UMC's operations and activities in China? That's number one. Number two, I'm Korean, and Korea is geographically further away from Taiwan than Japan is. Is Korea, if a crisis occurs, is Korea unaffected by this, or are there pieces of the puzzle here? What would Korea's role be if a crisis emerges in Taiwan? Thank you.
Thank you. So for the first question,
You know, I haven't thought very much about this question. You know, the first thing that comes to mind, and I think this is because of some of the conversations we've been having here in Tokyo, is the potential for really all Taiwanese businessmen in the mainland to serve as hostages in some way in the event of a military invasion, just as Tokyo is concerned that Japanese citizens on the mainland would also present an opportunity for hostage taking. My understanding is that the most advanced technologies sit in Taipei. So I don't know that there would be and the Tsai administration has been quite careful and has been more proactive in ensuring that sensitive technologies with national security implications are regulated and are not shared with the Chinese. Okay? In terms of South Korea's role, it did appear in the Biden-Yoon statement, a reference to stability in the Taiwan Strait. It seems that the Yoon administration is paying very close attention to the implications for Korea. I guess two very quick comments on that. It seems that the South Korean perspective is its alliance with the US remains focused on North Korea contingencies. I think there's starting to be a widening of that concept that it's also maybe about a threat from China. But I think Seoul is much less forward-leaning on that than Tokyo has been. So that alliance is primarily remains, and the deployment of THAAD remains focused on the North Korean contingency. Something else that is interesting is I think there are increasingly discussions and wargaming and scenario playing around what would happen on the Korean Peninsula with North Korea in a Taiwan contingency. And I think the results of those discussions are certainly nowhere near final, but the prospect of such a major military crisis so close by could trigger decision-making in North Korea to perhaps, it creates a certain opportunity for the North Korean regime as well. But again, I must emphasize that I think those discussions are quite preliminary, and it's not clear how the North Koreans would respond to a Taiwan Strait crisis, but that across the region, these discussions are accelerating as to how exactly those two situations are linked.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. I'm Maria Yamaguchi with the Associated Press. I'm wondering how this Taiwan's contingency concerns is sort of setting the tone in terms of Japan-China relations. Is this kind of a determining factor to decide sort of Japan-China relations for the time being, or is there other things that we should be looking at in terms of how Japan can sort of improve relations with China? Because I'm asking this because there's no mood of celebration for this 50th anniversary of Japan-China signing of the peace treaty. And my other question is sort of related to a previous one, how this Taiwan concern is going to affect other U.S. allies in the region, for example, like members of the FOIA or Quad in the issue. Thank you.
Great. So thank you for the question about Japan-China relations. My sense is that Japan will, while the Taiwan issue is clearly becoming a greater priority for Tokyo, that the tendency will be to not to directly reference or raise the issue in bilateral discussions with the Chinese or in their bilateral engagements, because there is still a concern about how sensitive the issue is and how provocative it would seem to the Chinese. But Japan also doesn't need to directly talk about Taiwan with the Chinese. It can still continue to upgrade its defense capabilities in light of in light of a military balance of power that is just overwhelmingly in China's favor. So it doesn't have to say this is about Taiwan. It's really just about Japan's defense, sort of more generally. Of course, Japan's remains economically reliant on China to some degree, and it is noteworthy that the meeting with Yang Jiechi and Japan's national security advisor did take place shortly after Pelosi's visit, after the Chinese were pretty unhappy with Japan's condemnation of the missiles falling into Japanese EEZ, signing on to statements condemning the move. So I think there we can see perhaps that the Chinese are aware as well that there will be an inclination on the Chinese side to try to drive a wedge between Tokyo and Washington. And so I think that is part of I think we can understand that meeting in light of that, and there might well be more efforts to diplomatically engage from Beijing, more overtures to Tokyo as well. In terms of members of the Quad, I think I don't have much to say about this, but what I'll note is that India made a statement that was a bit surprising. They called out Chinese militarization around Taiwan, and so that's rare for India to weigh in on this issue, because they too are sensitive to Chinese feelings. You could understand that decision as India has a border dispute with the Chinese. That dispute continues, and there's no real bilateral understanding. Basically, the Indian position is that if we don't resolve the border dispute, our bilateral engagement cannot return to normal. In playing up the Taiwan issue, one could understand it as India accruing more leverage in its bilateral relations with China. So that's my one reflection on other Quad members. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. That's a very enlightening discussion there. I know you're only in Tokyo for a few more days, but here's a year's honorary membership to the club.
Oh,
so if you're in town, you can come for a drink.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay, and a round of applause, please, for our guest.
Okay.